Good afternoon. Thank you for those of you still joining us in the room today and for those who are joining online. My name's Helen Collis. I'm health editor at POLITICO, and thank you for joining us for Politico's Competitive Europe Week. I'm joined on the stage by David Loew, who is CEO of Ipsen, a French biotech, to hear some of the unique challenges that face a mid-sized company operating in Europe now and whether Europe is helping or hindering it in its progress. But first, a little housekeeping. If you'd like to share what you hear said on the stage this afternoon, please do so using the hashtag Politico Competitive Week. So, thank you for joining us, David.
Thank you for having me. Is that working? Yeah, okay.
I think so. So looking at Ipsen's global footprint, this is a company that seems to love Europe. If your website is correct, all 4 of Ipsen's development centres are in Europe, and the company has a presence in virtually every EU country, plus Switzerland, Luxembourg, Ukraine, and elsewhere it has a presence in about 15 other markets, dominated by the largest ones: US, Canada, Brazil, China, Japan. Ipsen's early life was dominated by a handful of products in gastrointestinal treatments, and in more recent decades, the spreadsheet has been buoyed by sales of the company's Botox treatment, largely used for aesthetics, but also therapeutic purposes. Today, 5 cancer therapies make up 3/4 of the company's turnover. So, David, my first question to you is, would you describe Ipsen as one of Europe's success stories?
Okay, I don't want to pound my chest here. I was also working at Roche for 21 years and Sanofi for 7 years, now 4 years for Ipsen. I think Ipsen is a very dynamic company for sure. We have licensed in or acquired 25 new medicines in the last 2.5 years. We're proud to say that we have just gotten the approval of 2 rare disease drugs last Friday. So this is great news for us, and I would say especially great news for patients in Europe.
Fantastic. So, as you mentioned, you were at Roche previously, and we had someone on the panel earlier today from AstraZeneca, and we talked about, obviously AstraZeneca is a far larger company than Ipsen. It's only about 10 years older, though, or maybe 20 years older. And I wondered, obviously these are 2 very different companies, but in your view, what are the main reasons that companies like AstraZeneca have really grown to such large sizes, whereas Ipsen has remained in the kind of mid-sized category?
Well, I think those are choices of the investors, that it's a family, majority-owned Ipsen as a company, but then it's also where do you put your bets and how quickly do you want to grow. So it's also about capital allocation, yeah.
And would it be fair to say that Ipsen has a similar ambition? Do all companies want to grow to be as big as they can?
Yes, I would say. I think we have redefined the strategy now 4 years ago, and together with the family and the board, because we have 49% public shareholding, we have redefined a strategy where we really want to grow and become a much more global company. So now you have alluded towards at the beginning, we have opened up affiliates now also in Japan. We're active in China. We have 1/3 of our sales coming from the US, and we predict that about 50% are coming from the US.
And when you're making those decisions about where to locate certain facilities in the future, what is it that really kind of triggers the final endpoint? Is Europe still providing? It looks like Ipsen has a very big footprint in Europe, but is it becoming proportionately smaller for various reasons?
We will really go where the science is, and this is perhaps something where I would like to take a step back and take a bit of a higher view picture on what determines our thoughts about Europe. I have been in this industry, as I told you, now about 32 years. It seems like an awful long time, but I have seen, unfortunately, somewhat of a degradation of the life science environment in Europe, and the Draghi report has really outlined that Europe needs to get their act together on the life science industry. We have seen that the biotech industry is mostly today in the US, and now also, since a couple of years, a lot in China, much less so in Europe. And that is quite dramatic on several accounts. The first one is, it's dramatic from an economic account, because biotech companies, they create a lot of value, and also pharmaceutical companies create a lot of value by having plans, based on the soil, for example, in Europe. That creates a lot of jobs, and it creates a lot of additional jobs of suppliers around. But it's also bad news that we have kind of lost this leadership to the US and China for patience. Because what happens, and that I observe as a mid-sized company when we do licensing deal, and we have just done one this summer with Day One. When you do a licensing deal with a biotech, they will focus first and foremost on the US market. They have very easy access to capital, which you don't in Europe because the pension funds have to be more conservative. There are far fewer venture capitalist companies in Europe, so the access to capital plays a big role. The Nasdaq listing has a big effect in getting access to that capital. We have an environment where the R&D spend has been massively bigger now in the US. We have a distance where 20 years ago, the difference was about 2 billion investment from government investing into basic research. Now it's 25 billion. I mean, that's a huge difference nowadays between Europe and the US. So that's really a concern for me. And then there is a third one, which is the sovereignty. Europe, and we have seen it under COVID, Europe lost a lot of the sovereignty, and too many manufacturing sites are outside of Europe. So when you ask me, where am I going to put the next manufacturing site, we are a company which is owned by shareholders. We need to, and many of the shareholders are pension funds, so they have certain expectations in terms of the profitability and the risk of the investment. So we will have to go where we find the most attractive conditions. And unfortunately, that's not in Europe anymore. And I would really like to call on the European Commission to actually establish a task force to look at how can we bring life science industry back to Europe, strengthen the economical footprint, strengthen the security, and getting much faster access to innovation and also access. When you look at 50% of the drugs registered by the European Union are actually after 2 years not accessible to all people in Europe. That's quite dramatic. I mean, a brain cancer child needs to have new drugs. They get impacted by the cancer in their brain. Yeah.
Loads I'd love to dig into there, but we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to pick up on two things you said. One thing we heard earlier today from AstraZeneca is that they have such a big presence in Europe because of the science and because of the expertise here, and you're saying you're going where the science is, which is taking you to the US. What's the reason where you're seeing that differential? Is it specifically the products that you're looking in and the expertise that Europe doesn't have in those products, or is it, you mentioned the sort of the public funding towards research. Where's the difference there?
There are two differences. We bring new drug candidates on board, like basically all the pharmaceutical industry. We don't have a basic research, but we have a preclinical research. So what we do is we contract with universities, and there are great universities in Europe, but many of them, unfortunately, are not focused on translational science. What does this mean? When you do basic research, at one point, you want to translate this research into an outcome. And for the pharmaceutical industry, that would be a new drug. Now, if you do not focus on translational science, then the basic research is going to just sit there and not become productive unless somebody picks it up. And that often happens, for example, with other biotechs. And since most of the biotechs are in the US, they pick up some of the basic science, develop together with translational researchers in the US new science, and then they have a new drug candidate. And that actually is something that I think we need to strengthen in Europe, and besides the investment into the basic research.
So that translational process from Europe, I mean, it seems like, to me, a low-hanging fruit for Europe, because we have the universities, the academia, the experts there, but it's not getting through into they're not turning into the companies, and the patients are not receiving them first in the EU. They're going to the US, like you said. How can we solve that?
We need, on a European level, so that Brussels can help, we need to better coordinate the basic research, who does which work across Europe. That's not done today. And the second one, and this is more a country responsibility, I think the Minister of Research or Minister of Healthcare need to insist, and this is what the US has done, that the professors who have a research lab have to receive a part of the funding for the research lab, not just from public funding, but from royalties from drugs that eventually they are inventing through the translational science. And if they are not getting forced to do that, then basically what happens is they just let it sit on the basic research and they don't make that next step on how would that research actually potentially translate into a drug.
I see. Another thing you mentioned was that companies that are going to the US or biotechs that are research that's being brought to the US by biotechs launch first in the US. Obviously, we have a very different healthcare model, lots of models, in fact, in Europe, which are all based on the reimbursement model and universal healthcare model, which is fundamentally at the heart of the differences between these two markets. I don't see that changing anytime soon, but how can we encourage companies to launch in Europe at the same time as the US? And obviously, we know that the European Commission is trying to incentivize companies to do that. What's the best way to do it?
You know, this universal healthcare model has a lot of advantages because we have established a basic medicine, I would say, for the whole population. That's a great thing. We should keep that. But there are other consequences out of it. We have observed that because governments are scratching their head how to finance, different things that they want to finance, including some of government employees that might, consume a lot of the resources. They have reduced the amount spent on medicines. When I compare France as an example, like 5 years ago, the drug spend was 14% on the total healthcare spend. Today, it's 9%. So the problem is, if we don't find efficiencies in the healthcare system and we only slash on drug cost, of course you're not going to get access to innovation. And this is where we see that sham that it takes more than 2 years in average for a new drug to get to patients. And I think that's a bad thing. I think we should not have a healthcare system where patients need to wait for 2 years. If you're diagnosed with breast cancer, you want to be sure that you can get the best drugs, the most innovative drugs, as quickly as possible. So you don't have time to wait for a healthcare system, to think about HTA models and etc. And I think that's where we really would make a call that think about not as a cost, think about as a value creation. We're getting older. We want to keep people fit and work longer. So it's an investment. Imagine a world where we have faster access to drugs, where we have faster access to innovative drugs, and where we generate more innovative drugs on European soil by having more biotechs. I think that's what we have to work on as Europeans, and that's where I would call the European Commission, to establish this task force.
Well, you seem to have Mario Draghi on your side. In his report, he calls for a European market for medicines and a coordinated pricing mechanism. What, in your view, is the best way to achieve that? I don't know if you were here earlier, but there were a few suggestions made on the stage then.
I mean, that's a very tricky one, and I'm not the one as a private company to comment. Because, we see that, for example, Germany has very often pushed back on that idea. So it's a very painful one because they want to control the spend that they have. And when you look at the German system has access right from day one, which is very different to Italy, France, Spain, UK, you name it. And so there is going to be the tension between the ministries and the European Council on how would we translate that idea of Draghi into a more common space. Ideally, I think for the citizens, it would be a fair thing. But the problem is we still have nations in Europe. So unless Europe becomes like the US, an integrated country, which I don't see happening anytime soon, this tension is always going to stay.
I'm going to throw in one more question. I know we don't have a lot of time, but Europe is struggling to deliver on the ground the healthcare that populations need. We have chronic and critical workforce shortages, as well as very tight budgets. To what extent do these downstream conditions impact the success of businesses like Ipsen?
Oh, it has a big impact because, drugs can only be prescribed if disease is being correctly diagnosed, if the doctor is here to actually prescribe then a drug. So yes, it has very big consequences, and it has big consequences on the outcome on the patient. So I think as a society, we need to accept that we will have to spend more into healthcare because we're getting older. We want to be productive. We have to work longer. I mean, we cannot escape this. I think it's a great thing. I don't see myself retiring at 65. But, so we want to be fit when we do that. And we want to actually live to the end of our life with a very high quality of life. Today, we see 88-year-olds go golfing or sailing, et cetera, which, 20 years ago, you will not have seen. So it's actually a great thing, and we will have to assume that we will have to spend more. Having said that, of course, we cannot endlessly spend more, so we will have to find efficiencies in the healthcare system. And things, which can help that, in my view, would be the establishment of electronic medical records, which is not very prevalent yet in Europe. We see the US go with light speed on this axis. I mean, they are buying hospital systems like Mayo Clinic, Mount Sinai, you name it. They are buying up clinics. They are having electronic medical records, and you can run analytics on what intervention works well and what does not. If you don't have that access to that data, and I get it that you want to protect patients' individual data, and you can anonymize that, and we have to, obviously. But if you don't do that, you cannot root out the inefficiencies in the system. So I think we have a big task in Europe to make our healthcare system much more agile and fit and transparent.
Mm-hmm. Loads I'd love to carry on discussing with you, David, but we are out of time. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Kindly remain seated, everybody. We have one final short panel with Doug Busvine, our trade editor, speaking with Camille Gies and Koen Verhelst from the trade team. So thank you very much.
Thank you.